respectful of your time. And so I want to start out by asking, given the COVID numbers now, we are really trying super hard to follow all of our mitigation practices. So I'm going to ask that you keep your masks up the entire time. I know mine's off right now. That's just so you can hear me. It'll be back on immediately after this. But yeah, we are going to ask that, and we're going to ask it in worship as well. It's kind of been our expectation, but with the COVID fatigue, we've started to see a few people dropping masks in worship and in some other places. So we really want this to be a safe place that everybody feels comfortable coming to. So that is our request of you, that you keep those masks on. Thank you all for coming out tonight. This is our first time live streaming a class, and so we're really excited about that. And our hope is, if you know folks who didn't want to come but want to watch a class, we're going to live stream it. We'll ultimately put it up on the website. It's going to be on our YouTube channel, so folks could watch it later, but also encourage them to watch it if they aren't comfortable coming in person, to watch it live stream, because they can experience what you're experiencing, and then you can talk about it tomorrow. So please kind of spread that word that we're trying this, and really hope that it's a success for people both in the church and out. I know I have some people from my work who have experienced, they've said they're interested in watching it as well. So spread the word. So without further ado, I wanted to introduce Dr. Weima. He is a professor of New Testament at Calvin Seminary in Minnesota. So there's a good, Michigan, sorry. I'm sorry, not Minnesota. We were talking and I was thinking Minnesota doesn't have clouds and Michigan does. So anyway, Michigan, I got the wrong state. Cold, so we know why they're in Arizona, not as cold normally. So, and he is a Pauline scholar. And Pastor Turner, Dave Turner, came to me and said, Beth, we have this opportunity. He might be willing to teach a few classes. Would we like to take advantage of that? And your discipleship committee was like, yes, yes, and yes, we would love to take advantage of that to get an expert in the field. So we have 3 weeks of classes on Paul, and I think that they're going to be really interesting and great. So here you go.
Good. Well, thank you, Beth, for those kind words of welcome. And my wife and I are indeed from Grand Rapids, Michigan. Although you can defend yourself by saying there is a Grand Rapids, Minnesota. I had a friend who was a little bit, I don't know about his intellectual ability, but he called me one night. He was from, my wife and I grew up in Canada. He was from Canada. He said, hi, Jeff. He said, I'm in Grand Rapids. I said, well, great. Come on over. And I tried to just give him directions. Things weren't working out. And then it finally came to light that he was in Grand Rapids, Minnesota, rather than Grand Rapids, Michigan. So it was kind of a big difference between that. But it's a pleasure for me to be at Valley Presbyterian again. I say again because there have been a couple of times in January in the past where my wife and I have escaped the cold and snow of Michigan, and during our time here, I've been able to share some insights with members of your congregation, and I'm glad that that's been able to happen again. Part of it's been able to happen again because of Pastor David Turner and his wife Stacy went on one of my biblical tours. I lead quite a few biblical tours, one to Greece, one to Turkey, one to Italy, and then one to Israel and Jordan. And so Pastor Dave and Stacy, only about a year or so ago, joined us on that Israel trip. And we had a lot of fun kind of getting to know each other again. And we reconnected this past week. And so I'm glad for that connection also to Valley Presbyterian. So I am a New Testament professor. My wife and I have been married, I have to be careful, get this right. It changes every year in my own defense. I think it's 38, 37, right in there anyway. And we have 4 kids, 4 married kids, and 8 grandchildren. And I teach most of the time at Calvin Theological Seminary in Grand Rapids, Michigan. I do a lot of speaking and teaching, leading biblical tours. I write some books. I've written about 6 books or so. But my area of specialty really is the Apostle Paul. And it gives me some comfort, to speak on something I know something about. And so I'm happy to be here with you tonight and next week and the week after that. So there are 3 parts to the series, and you can tell others if they're not here this week, they're welcome to come next week because they're all somewhat independent. Today we're looking at Paul the man. Next week, Paul the letter writer. Paul is extremely gifted. Actually, very cleverly so in his letters. And next week, we're going to look at the little letter of Philemon in order to illustrate that. And then the last week, Paul the missionary. Because I was asked to have something in one of my presentations about the biblical tours that I lead and how knowledge of the geography, history, social culture of the ancient world really makes the Bible not only understandable, but a lot more alive. And so in that 3rd week, I hope to show some images and tell some of the stories from Paul's missionary journeys which illustrate that. So this week, Paul the man. Next week, Paul the letter writer. And the 3rd week, Paul the missionary. I hope to also leave some time at the end for some questions, and so keep track of that, and don't be intimidated. There's a mic here that at the end you'll hopefully feel comfortable in asking your question, and I'm hoping I can answer them. What else can I say? We don't have a lot of time. And so I'm going to live up to my high school nickname of Motor Mouth. So I'm going to speak quickly, but with the slides and with the handout, you can go back and kind of review things or clarify things as you will. And so without further ado, I'm ready to start, and I hope that you are too, and those who are watching us live streaming this thing. So, one last thing, you can see from my middle initials that I was destined to be a New Testament professor, right? Jeffrey A.D. And so my parents had some forethought, even though I know that they, and not in their wildest imaginations, imagined that their son would grow up to be a pastor and a Christian teacher. And you have an email address, and so if you have a question that maybe you feel uncomfortable asking now or later, there's a way for you to contact me down the road, and I welcome you to do that. So why study the Apostle Paul? Ray Brown was a very influential New Testament scholar. He just passed away a couple of years ago, but he said this. He said, next to Jesus, Paul has been the most influential figure in the history of Christianity. Whether or not they know Paul's words well, through what they've been taught about doctrine and piety, all Christians have become Paul's children in the faith. That last phrase I want you to think about for a moment, namely, all Christians have become Paul's children in the faith. And so I'm wondering if you see yourself as a child of Paul. And I'm also imagining that if you ask yourself that question, the answer may not necessarily be yes. Why? Because, there's the stereotype about the Apostle Paul, that he's a hardliner, he has nasty things to say, he's extremely judgmental. I've met, frankly, a number of people in my life who aren't really fans at all of the Apostle Paul and therefore wouldn't want to think of themselves as being a child of the Apostle. But I want to suggest to you that's probably a misunderstanding of this character. Yes, Paul can be hard and harsh if the circumstances require it. So if the very heart of the gospel is at stake in the letter to the Galatians, Paul will say, oh, foolish Galatians, right? Oh, nincompoops, right? And those people pushing circumcision, I hope they go all the way and castrate themselves. I mean, that's found in the Bible. That's what Paul says. But that same apostle, are you ready for this? In a completely different context, will not only in a patriarchal world compare himself to a woman, not only to a mother, but Paul will compare himself to a breastfeeding mother. You can check that out in 1 Thessalonians 2, verse 7, where Paul writes to the Thessalonians and says, when we were with you, we were like a nursing mother caring for her own children. So it's a very powerful, warm, affectionate picture of the Apostle Paul. So I'm hoping that this presentation today, and the next 2 weeks too, will give you maybe a more fuller or richer understanding of this guy that we call Paul, or the Apostle Paul. And that, in a certain sense, you won't mind thinking of yourself as a child of Paul. Well, this week we're looking at Paul the man, to kind of give some flesh and bones to this name and character. And to do so, we're going to use his letters, what Paul himself wrote. We're going to use what people wrote about Paul, especially the book of Acts, but also some extra canonical books, although we have to use those sources with some care. Now, I divided Paul's life into 11 categories. That sounds like a lot. We're not going to look at all of them in great detail. Some of them we're going to look at very in depth because they're unlikely to be known to you. Some we're going to skip for next week or the week after that. And others, there's just, they aren't such a long period in Paul's life. But I've got 11 different headings, 11 different categories chronologically in the Apostle Paul's life. And we're going to spend the first little while in what I call Paul the early years. It sounds like a Friday ABC movie, Paul the early years, inquiring minds want to know, right? Don't you want to know what Paul was like in his early life? And actually, a lot of that information explains things about what he did or how he responds later in his life. Well, where was Paul born, for example? Well, it's clear he was born in the province of Cilicia and in the city of Tarsus. You can see that from a number of the texts. Where is Cilicia? It's a region of modern-day Turkey. And Tarsus is a key city in there. In fact, Paul says in that last slide, he says, I am a Jew from Tarsus in Cilicia, a citizen of no ordinary city. Have you ever introduced yourself that way? You say, hi, my name is so-and-so, from Phoenix, no ordinary city, Well, actually, these words are significant. Why? Because a very famous ancient writer named Euripides said that about Athens, because Athens was no ordinary city. And now Paul is using that phrase to describe his hometown of Tarsus. And you probably don't know much about Tarsus, and that's why I want to stress to you that Tarsus was a big city in the ancient world. It was an important city because, well, it had a lot of commerce. It had a couple of different philosophical schools. It is located, you can see on the map, right on the edge of the Mediterranean. Not on the very edge, because that's too dangerous and exposed to pirates. Pirates were a real problem in the turn of the century. Just located inland a little more safely, and then a little river from the Mediterranean to the city to transport goods to and forth. And Paul comes from then Tarsus in the province of Cilicia. However, he was educated in Jerusalem. We don't know whether it was a little boy or as a young man, but Paul left Tarsus and went to Jerusalem and studied, quote, under Gamaliel. And that's the point where you're supposed to go, ooh. Yeah, because actually that's pretty impressive. I call that the Harvard School of Ancient Judaism, because even the Bible, even the New Testament says that Gamaliel was honored by all people. And already here we're getting a good clue that Paul comes from a family of status and of money, because, well, can anybody go to Harvard? I mean, they would say, yes, of course you can, right? Well, we somehow think that, if you had a lot of money and a lot of clout, it would probably help, right? And can anybody study at the feet of Gamaliel? Well, maybe in theory, yes, but in reality, it will help if mom or dad have a bit of political or religious clout and some money. And we'll come back to this later from the kind of noble background that Paul comes from. Now, he belonged to a religious group. Almost everybody did, right? Even though Judaism had a couple of key ideas in common, not everybody believed in the same thing. Sometimes we should talk about Judaisms, plural. And you probably are familiar with groups like the Sadducees and the Zealots and the Essenes and the Herodians. And there's a temptation sometimes for modern-day Christians to kind of lump them all together and say, those are just the guys who gave Jesus a hard time, you know, the Sadducees, the Smadducees, and all those E's kind of people. However, they were different from each other, and Paul clearly belonged to the Pharisees, And that's a big deal in his life. So, for instance, we're not there yet because we're only at the beginning of his life, but much, much later, you probably know that he was in Jerusalem, and he was arrested, and he was brought before the Jewish leaders, the Sanhedrin, and Paul did not want to be tried by the Sanhedrin because he was accused of taking a Gentile into the inner court of the temple, passing the line of the Gentiles into the line of the Jews, and that was a penalty punished by death. We've even uncovered 2 of the 14 stones that said both in Greek and in Latin, whoever crosses this line, thanatos in Greek will follow you. Thanatos is the Greek word for death. Death will follow you. And Paul was accused of doing that. And he didn't want to be tried by the Sanhedrin because he knew that they had it in for him, and so he was very clever. He knows that the Sanhedrin is made up of Pharisees and Sadducees. And he knows that one of the unique beliefs of the Sadducees, different from almost all other Jews, including the Pharisees, is a belief in the resurrection of the dead. And so Paul, very deliberately, very calculatedly, stands in front of this high court of Jews and says, I stand before you, right, as a what? As a Pharisee. As a descendant from Pharisee, and I stand on trial because of my hope in the resurrection of the dead. And so suddenly, half of this group is for Paul, right, all the Pharisees, and the Sadducees are against him. And so Paul cleverly divides this political group so they can't reach a decision, and so then Paul is spit back into Roman control, which is exactly what he wanted. So here's just one example where knowing that Paul belongs to the Pharisees and his background, that explains an important event in his life. But here's maybe a more broader significance. Who were the Pharisees anyway? Well, they were like the ultra-conservatives among the Jews. You may remember from Exodus on Mount Sinai that God called his people to be what? A kingdom of priests and a holy nation. A kingdom of priests and a holy nation. Priests had specific laws to follow to maintain their holiness. Normal Jews did not have to follow those laws. But the Pharisees came along and said, even though we're not priests, right? We want to be a kingdom of priests and a holy nation like God has called us. We're going to voluntarily submit ourselves to these laws of holiness even though we don't have to do them. You have to be kind of conservative, right, for that kind of dedication. In fact, the word Pharisee almost certainly comes from an Aramaic or Hebrew root that means to be separated. So actually, you could call the Pharisees the separated ones. So you'd meet Paul, and Paul would say, hey, my name is Paul, I belong to the separated party. So these are Jews who think it's not enough to be separated from the Gentiles. No. We want to be separated even from our fellow Jews, at least those who don't obey the rules to holiness to the same degree that we do. So I want you to think about Paul before he's a Jesus follower, and he's gone to the Harvard School of Judaism. Ooh, thank you. You're right. Okay, that's right. And he's trained under the feet of Gamaliel, and he's like ultra-conservative. Right? And not only does he belong to the most conservative party, he calls himself, notice I've got the adjective in front of the word Pharisee, I've got the adjective zealous. Zealous. That word comes up a couple of times in his letters and also about him in Acts. Now that word zealous is a significant one. Why? Because you should hear an echo of Numbers 25. Because, well, Numbers 25 was a very infamous incident in Israel history. This is during their wandering days, and during this time they were in the land of Moab, and the men of women slept with the women of Moab. In fact, there was even one Israeli male who was so brazen, he kind of took this Moabite woman and paraded her in front of the elders into his tent. And then we read that Phinehas was filled with something. He was filled with zeal. And this Phineas, who was filled with zeal, took a spear and thwomp through the man and the woman. And the Bible says, you can read it over there, right? He, that is Phineas, and his descendants will have a covenant of everlasting priesthood. Why? Because he was zealous for the honor of his God, and he made atonement for the Israelites. Did you catch that? The Bible doesn't say that he murdered or he killed those people. It says that he made atonement means like salvation, right? I mean, people do guilty things and then they have to atone for their sin. This act of murder wasn't murder. No, this zealous act paid for it, atoned for the sin of his people. I want you to get a sense of how scary this kind of mentality would be in an ultra-conservative. An ultra-conservative who would go anywhere and do almost anything and feel full of zeal to do whatever he wants, right? Because against people like Jesus followers, right? Because in his mind, he would be making atonement for the sins of his people. To put it even more crassly, Paul was one scary dude if you were a Jesus follower in the first century. And so, not surprisingly, we read about his pre-Christian life that he was a persecutor of the church. And we read about that in Acts. The very first time Paul appeals on the scene, he's supporting the stoning of Stephen. And in his own letters, he also a number of times refers to the fact that he persecuted the early church. What did he look like? In a way, maybe it doesn't matter, but on the other hand, there may be some relevance to understanding some of Paul in his letters. There's this reference in 2 Corinthians 10:10 which is only hinting. I'm whispering now. When I say whispering versus shouting, I don't mean decibel level. I mean, I'm talking about level of certainty with which I'm speaking something, okay? Most of the times I say things that I'm clearly certain about, right? Even though you can ask me about them. But there are sometimes we don't have enough information, right? And we're kind of whispering. We're speaking tentatively. So here's one text which suggests that Paul wasn't, I'll say again in colloquial terms, a stud. What's the evidence? Well, the Corinthians, with whom he didn't have a good relationship, they conceded that Paul's letters were pretty powerful, right? His writing is pretty good, but we read, in person, he is unimpressive. You need to know that in the first century, public speaking was a competitive sport. People competed with each other to talk good. You caught that, right? That was bad. Okay, talk well. Anyway, just seeing, you know. So many people are using good as an adverb lately. You know, it'll probably be okay pretty soon. Anyway, people back then had competitions. And part of the competitions of speaking well wasn't just to speak well, it was also to look good. We read about rhetoricians in the ancient world who would put oil on their body, kind of like wrestlers do today, in order for their muscles to kind of stand out and to glisten. Anyway, the Corinthians are kind of saying, you know, Paul's letters, okay, we reluctantly agree that he's pretty powerful in his letters, but in person, he's a nobody, right? He's not impressive at all. And we have a non-biblical source that seems to support that. The Acts of Paul. So this is written after the New Testament. You have to be careful how to use this source, but notice the description of Paul. And this person saw Paul coming, a man small in size, bald-headed, bandy-legged, I think that means skinny chicken legs, of noble mien with eyebrows meeting, we call that a unibrow, rather hook nose, full of grace. Sometimes he looked like a man, and sometimes he had the face of an angel. It's clearly written by a Christian, right? I found this was a kind of like CSI in Germany, right? You know, they do these kind of composite reconstructions, and this was a reconstruction they made of the Apostle Paul. It really isn't important, other than to get you to think about something you probably wouldn't think about, and that is for somebody who was small and not very good looking, right? How much even more challenging, given the expectations in that day, would be for the Apostle Paul to go from place to place and try to proclaim the gospel, right? To kind of speak the word in a way that people would respond well to. Still in Paul's early stage, right? Trust me, the other stages will go a lot faster. But these early stages have connections with his later life, and they sometimes aren't so well known by Christians today. Paul was a Roman citizen, and that actually had a number of important implications on his life and ministry too. So there were 3 ways that you could become a Roman citizen in the ancient world. The easiest way, and that was the Pauline way, and that is you can be born into it. That's the easiest way. A harder way is you have to do something pretty important for Rome. I mean, it has to be pretty significant, and they give it to you as a reward. And then the third way is you have to pay a lot. We don't know how much exactly, but you have to pay a lot. And you may or may not remember that when Paul was arrested on the end of the 3rd missionary journey in Jerusalem, and the reason he was arrested is because, we said earlier, the Jews there thought wrongly that Paul had taken one of the Greeks traveling with him into the inner part of the temple, and there's like this mob scene, and the Romans, who have kind of garrison on the corner of the Jerusalem temple to keep a close eye on the Jews, they see a disturbance down below, they run down, they kind of rescue Paul actually from his fellow Jews who were in a mob state, going to do him harm. And that's when Paul pulls out his Roman citizenship. And the commander says, whoa, he said, I paid a lot of money for my citizenship. He said, where did you get yours, Paul? Right? So that's one incident from Paul's life that relates to his citizenship. Philippi is a well-known one, right? On the 2nd missionary journey, we'll talk about the Philippi one in week number 3, but maybe you remember when Paul cast, this will whet your appetite for week 3, Paul cast the spirit out of the slave girl. Okay, and I'm going to say what the Greek says, okay, in Acts. Paul cast the python spirit out of the slave girl. Did they get your attention? Because you should come back in 3 weeks and say, well, what's with this python spirit? That's very significant to the story. I'll explain it then. Anyway, because he cast out this python spirit, the 2 men who owned this slave and made a lot of money of her weren't happy, and so they had Paul arrested. He was beaten, thrown into jail, and then the next day, not right away, the next day, Paul pulled out his Roman citizenship card, and everybody kind of freaked out. If you read this, they're like, oh, our bad, And actually, they had good reason to freak out. Why? Because this Roman citizenship was a huge perk, and one of the huge privileges of Roman citizenship is you were guaranteed a fair trial, or you could appeal, whatever you were facing to the highest court of the land, namely Caesar himself. This coin is a nice illustration of it. If you look at the coin, the person on your left is wearing a robe. I forgot to mention, if I go back a slide over here, only Roman citizens could wear a toga. Okay, a toga. I grew up in the 80s, and we had these toga parties, and now I realize I had no right to wear a toga at those parties because I wasn't a Roman citizen. Only Roman citizens could wear a toga. Anyway, on the coin, on the one on the left, you see, you can barely make out, he's wearing a toga, clearly symbolizing that this is a Roman citizen. And the person in the middle with military garb is about to arrest him or punish him, and behind him is one of his lictors, one of his soldiers. And then the coin says in Latin, provoco, which means I appeal. Because the coin is advertising the fact that Roman citizens have this privilege. They can appeal, right? The guaranteed, to fair treatment. And Paul used that, but in Philippi, he didn't use it right away. He used it the next day, and that's why I'm suggesting to you, the city officials there kind of freaked out, like, our bad. Okay, Paul, sorry, why don't you just leave town, okay? We'll just forget about the whole thing. And Paul said, not so fast. I think we'll hang around just for a couple of days with Lydia just to make a point, okay? And then also, I mentioned the Jerusalem incident a minute ago, and then Caesarean appeal. So Paul, when he was arrested in Jerusalem, squired away to Caesarea Maritima in the middle of the night. He spent 2 years there. Maybe we'll talk about that a little later on. Anyway, at the end, he did provoco, right? At the end, he appealed to Caesar, and that's why Paul had that, we all probably know from Sunday school already, right? The harrowing boat journey and the crash, and he finally did make it to Rome. And the book of Acts ends up with Paul in Rome waiting to meet before Caesar, who was Nero at the time. So Paul's Roman citizenship is an important part of his life. Here's another aspect in which I think many of us need to just change our opinion a little bit. We so often talk about Paul's what? Paul's imprisonment. And, you know, the word imprison means like jail cells, chains, or whatever, right? And that's actually not the way to think about Paul's situation. Because remember, he's a Roman citizen, and so he's under house arrest is a better way to think of it. He's given a lot of freedom. And you can see that even in the biblical texts themselves. For instance, under the Caesarean 2-year imprisonment, Acts 24:23 says, to give him some freedom and permit his friends to take care of his needs. And at the end of Acts, when Paul is in Rome, he's not in prison. No, he's in his, you see it says right there, we got to Rome, Paul was allowed to live by himself with a soldier to guard him. And for 2 whole years, Paul stayed there in his own rented house and welcomed all who came to see him. And so it's more accurate for us to think about kind of house arrest. And this explains why it was possible for Paul to carry on his ministry even during these times of house arrest, right? You ever watch these mob movies, you know, where the bigwig maybe gets caught and he goes to jail, but he's still kind of controlling things behind the scene, you know, in jail? I'm not suggesting Paul was a mob boss, but I mean, that's a little bit of an analogy for the Apostle Paul. Yes, he's under house arrest in Caesarea for 2 years. Yes, he's under house arrest in Rome for 2 years or more, right? But Paul is still carrying on ministry. He's still receiving visitors. He's sending out his helpers to former churches. He's writing letters, right? We've got 4 letters that we call prison letters, and maybe we should better call them captivity letters or house arrest letters or something like that. But all of that is due to Paul's Roman citizenship. Now this slides into his being a leather worker, because that's kind of interesting to me, because I forgot to mention that his citizenship is yet another clue that Paul comes from money and from power. There isn't much of a middle class in the ancient world. There are lots of have-nots and just a few haves, and it looks as if Paul comes from the haves, right? Trained at the feet of Gamaliel. Ooh, right, all right. And Roman citizenship, those are a couple of important clues that he comes from the upper class. And so it's kind of striking that someone from the upper class would work with his own hands. I mean, in America, we have this idea that, you know, you're a self-made man or a self-made woman. You know, you're not afraid to get your hands dirty and do hard work. Well, in the ancient world, and still today in many parts of the Middle East and Far East, the only people who work with their hands are poor people, right? So it's striking that Paul has this menial labor. And that's such a big part of his life, too. One, he used this as evidence of his integrity. I'm looking at my clock because I always run out of time, and I'm trying to live up to my nickname of Motor Mouth, so hang in there. But people back then apparently would accuse Paul of being a freeloader, right? Because Paul does say and does take advantage of his, not his Roman citizenship, but in his other pocket, he had an apostleship card. An apostleship card gets you what? Gets you free food and free housing. And Paul was very sensitive about the fact that some people, maybe not Christians, but others in the community said, well, he's only a fake, he's only a charlatan, he's only in it, you know, to take advantage of your hospitality. And so Paul, by working, one of the reasons I think that he worked is he clearly wanted to demonstrate his genuineness, his sincerity. He wanted to free himself from the attacks that he was only in it for his own gain. Secondly, he gave an example to believers. In the Thessalonian church, there were some people who were lazy, who were taking advantage of the hospitality of Christians. Some apparently were saying, these Jesus freaks are pretty good. I mean, you know, you just say, I love Jesus, and they like let you live in their house for free, and they give you food, you know, yay, right? Anyway, this problem dragged on, and Paul had to deal with it a couple of times in 1 Thessalonians and stronger, a whole chapter in 2 Thessalonians. But another reason that Paul worked was to give a model, to give himself as an example for other Christians who should be self-sufficient in their labors. This one, I think, also is important because if you don't like Paul, I'm hoping here's another window into a much more humble, much more attractive side of the Apostle Paul. I think that Paul, the majority of Christians, I should say, the majority of the earliest Christians came from the have-nots, right? Every church needs at least one or two haves, because the haves have something that the have-nots do not have, and that is namely a house. And that's really important because Christianity is not an officially recognized religion, and Christians have to meet somewhere, and so they meet in a house. We have house churches, but wait a minute, most people don't have a house. The only people who have a house are the haves, the rich people, and so everywhere Paul goes, he's got to find at least one person who's a little bit rich and will allow their home to be the home base for the church, okay? And we can see that throughout his life. Now, the majority of people, though, in the church are have-nots from the lower class. And I think that Paul works, another reason he works, is he kind of puts himself on the level of the majority of his people, or the people he's ministering to. Okay? So here would be an example. Let's imagine I have a house in Paradise Valley. I don't know too much, but I've heard the houses in Paradise Valley are kind of expensive. So let's imagine that I have enough money to live in Paradise Valley, and I've probably got, a couple of cars, maybe a Beamer in the garage, okay? And I feel God has called me to do ministry in downtown Phoenix, okay? And so one option is I leave my $5,000 or $6,000 square foot home in Paradise Valley and drive my Beamer to one of the seedy parts of Phoenix, do ministry, and then every night I drive home. That's one way to do it. Another option is, even though I could afford the big house in Paradise Valley, even though I have enough money for the Beamer, I voluntarily buy a much more modest home in downtown Phoenix, and I either don't have a car and use public transportation or buy something smaller, right? Why? Because I want to identify more closely with the people to whom I'm ministering. Do you see the analogy? And I think this reflects well on Paul. Paul, who came, as I've stressed a couple of times, from a rich, seemingly, and powerful family, that Paul kind of humbles himself by working with his own hands in order to better and more effectively minister to those around him. Well, boy, we spent a long time on just the early years, right? I have very little time for all the other categories. So are you ready? Here we go. The next category actually doesn't take very long, but had a huge impact. So Paul's conversion was, we would say, a paradigm-shifting event. You may not know it's told 3 different times in Acts, and you can read those different accounts. But I want you to appreciate what I've already tried to suggest to you, namely that Paul was what? That Paul was like an ultra-conservative. He was not only a Pharisee, he was a zealous Pharisee, right? He'll go anywhere and do anything to get rid of those Jesus followers because he's atoning for the sin of his Jewish people, right? So just imagine that kind of guy, that kind of extreme person suddenly meets Jesus, and it's like, whoa. Of course, an encounter with Jesus would be paradigm changing for any of us, right? But just imagine for Paul, right, the shift that would take place. So this conversion experience is huge. And it's interesting and significant that every time where Paul is questioned for his status, what's his new status? He's an apostle. Right? Remember that other card in the other pocket? Because there were some churches that didn't think he was an apostle. They say, Paul, were you a disciple of Jesus? No. Did you hang out with Jesus like the other disciples did for 3 years? No. I mean, who are you anyway, Paul? You're a nobody. Okay. So there were some churches like Galatian churches. The Corinthian church, even though he founded them, they also were pushing back against him. Whenever Paul was questioned for his apostolic status, what did he appeal to? He never appealed to the head boys in Jerusalem. He never said, oh, the apostles, voted and they all said that he never did something like that. He always appealed to his direct encounter with Jesus Christ, right? You can see that there, right? In 1 Corinthians 9. I've seen the Lord, haven't I? The answer is yes. And the beginning of Galatians, right at the very start of the letter, because they're questioning his status. And Paul said, I did not receive the gospel from any human source, nor was I taught it. Rather, I received it by revelation from Jesus Christ himself. So the conversion, huge, huge impact in Paul's life. And he goes back to it, he appeals to it in his letters and in his later ministry. Third heading. Now, I got to make sure that we catch something here for this third heading. Notice I've called it early missionary activity. If you're a student of Paul, and many of us have been, you're used to thinking of Paul's first missionary journey and his second missionary journey and his third missionary journey, right? Now, this heading suggests, and doesn't just suggest, claims, asserts, that before Paul had a first missionary journey, he was already involved in missions. That's the part I want you not to miss. And then notice the years we're talking about. Don't worry so much about the actual number, but notice how many they are. So 47 minus 33 equals 14. So I'm suggesting to you that there are 14 years between the time that Paul met Jesus and he began what we now wrongly call his first missionary journey. You with me? So I'm really stressing this because this is kind of like the black hole of Paul's life. Most of us don't even know it exists, let alone what was in there. Because we don't have a lot of information about this period, this 14-year period. So I'm going to spend a couple of minutes on this because it's probably new to many of us. So I'm going to divide the 14-year period into 3 plus 10 plus, checking 1. Yeah, that's right. Okay, 14. So 3, 10, 1. 3, 10, 1. All part of these 14-year early missionary activity. We begin with the first 3-year period. So most of us are aware that Paul has this phrase about, going to Arabia, right? To Arabia and Damascus for 3 years. So after Paul met Jesus on the road to Damascus, and in Damascus he was healed, and then we read about 3 years before he goes back to Jerusalem. And lots of Christians have, I think, kind of romanticized this 3-year period. And I understand, there's a certain amount of logic to it. Most people say something like this. Now, when Paul met Jesus, that like blew him away. And in a sense, they're right, because remember, he was a zealous Pharisee and he met Christ, like, whoa, right? And it was such a traumatic event that Paul needed like 3 years in Arabia. What's Arabia? Probably the desert. So Paul was like living like a monk all by himself, like 3 years, because he had to just somehow, make sense of all of this. And what's more, God was preparing him during these 3 years for a long lifetime of service, okay? So this is the kind of image of the 3-year period. And I say it's almost certainly wrong. Why do I say that? Well, first of all, it doesn't fit Paul's character, right? If you know anything about Paul, he's a very action-oriented person. He gets into trouble everywhere he goes. That's kind of just general. Actually, in Acts, it says that Paul immediately, the word is immediately, began preaching in the synagogues, all right? So Acts itself says that, it wasn't like this 3-year quiet do nothing. No, right away, Acts says, immediately he went to the synagogues and he actually said the opposite of what he previously believed. He went to Jews and said, yeah, guess what? I was completely wrong about this Jesus guy. And then this other fascinating piece of clue is found in 2 Corinthians 11:32. What does it say in 2 Corinthians 11:32? It's just a little offhanded reference. But there's a reference about how the king of Arabia, and his name is Aretas, and we know about this character from other sources, Aretas IV, if you want to be precise. Have you ever been to Petra? Anyone? Come with me on one of my trips. We'll show you, all right? There's the tomb of Aretas IV. But anyway, the governor under King Aretas, Arabia, and so forth, had put out word that this Paul should be arrested. And I think you probably know the story that Paul had to kind of escape out of the city over the wall in a basket. I mean, I assume you know all this stuff, right? Yes. So you have to ask yourself, how would the governor's a pretty high up position, right? How in the world would the governor of Arabia even know that Paul exists, let alone have word out that he should be arrested? Well, I know why. Because Paul, according to 1 Corinthians 9 now, right? Woe to me unless I do something. Woe to me unless I preach the gospel. And Acts itself said, Paul immediately began preaching. So, and when you preach the gospel, you get into trouble, right? I mean, you say things that are very countercultural. Things that Romans don't like, things that Jews don't like. Nobody likes the gospel. And so Paul naturally got into trouble. And so this little reference also, I think, confirms the idea that this 3-year period was not at all one of quiet reflection in the middle of nowhere, but actually was, as the heading here, it was part of his earliest missionary activity. Okay, that's 3 of the 14 years. Now we go to the 10. Not quite to the 10. I have one more little step in between. Paul, after 3 years, goes back to Jerusalem. Not surprisingly, none of the apostles want to meet with Paul. They're like, I don't want to meet with Paul, you meet with Paul. And this is, I don't want to meet with Paul, you meet with Paul. They all thought it was like some clever scheme, like going in the underground, in the gang, right? And although it sounds crazy, remember Paul was kind of crazy. I mean, he was that kind of fanatical guy to maybe kind of go underground like for 3 years and just pretend to be a Jesus follower and then suddenly arrest them all and kill, or whatever. And finally it was Barnabas. That's important later in the story. Barnabas introduces Paul to the apostles, and they find out that he's legit. They say, oh, he is a Jesus follower. Yay. But as I've already suggested to you, wherever Paul goes, he gets into trouble. And trouble follows him in Jerusalem, and a lot of the apostles are like, Paul, we love you, man, but life is too hot with you here, And so they take him to Caesarea, on the Maritima. They put him on a boat and say, Paul, we're sending you home. We're sending you to Tarsus. Makes sense, Tarsus, because that's where he came from a long, long time ago. Yeah, okay, you see, bye, Paul, right? And off he goes, and 10 years in Tarsus. 10 years. And I wish we knew more about what happened during these 10 years. What did his parents say when he came home? Paul, we had such high hopes for you. We sent you to the Harvard School of Judaism, and look what's become of you. Right? What did Paul think? I mean, he sacrificed everything to become a Jesus follower, and now it's like, what? Now the church is ignoring me, Are they? They're sending me in the middle of nowhere? But what happened during these 10 years? Well, after 10 years, of course, meantime, the Christian church is still being persecuted by other opponents, and the church, though, is growing. And the church in Antioch, so you can see there are a bunch of Antiochs in the ancient world, so make sure you know which one we're looking at. This is actually like the 3rd or 4th largest city in the ancient world, Antioch of Syria. Anyway, the church there was really growing by leaps and bounds, and Barnabas was sent there to help them. So the apostles in Jerusalem sent Barnabas up to Antioch to help the church, and Barnabas helped them, and he's going like, whew, this is a lot of work. We could really use some more leaders. And he suddenly says, I remember Paul. That's right. I remember he's, right? And so somehow Barnabas gets Paul from Tarsus, this is not so far away, and gets Paul to go from Tarsus to Antioch, and Paul ministers there with Barnabas for at least a year. 3 plus 10 plus 1 equals 14 years. One other thing, we're not sure how long this is. Before anything else happens, Paul makes another trip to Jerusalem. So there's a big famine in the region of Judea, and so the Christians in Antioch pull together an offering, not to be confused with an offering collection that Paul will make later in his life, a much bigger and significant event. Anyway, Barnabas and Paul travel down, bring that gift, and then return. That's the second time Paul has been in Jerusalem as a Jesus follower. Finally then, 14 years, finally now we're back to where you got in Sunday school, right? What you learned was the first missionary journey. And I don't have time to do the whole first missionary journey. That's why I want you to come back on week 3. Remember week 3? Paul the man today, Paul the letter writer next week. Week 3, Paul the missionary. Yeah, and I'll tell you a story or two about the first missionary journey, and especially how understanding the culture, the history, the geography makes some of these stories come alive. Anyway, who goes on the first missionary journey? It's Paul and Barnabas and Mark, John Mark. The three of them go to the island of Cyprus. And you say, of course they went to Cyprus because that's where Barnabas is from. That's where his family comes, takes advantage. Some great things happen there on the island of Cyprus, and they sail over to Perge. See Perge in the map? That's part of modern-day Turkey. And John Mark says, I'm going home. Paul says, what do you mean you're going home? He says, I'm going home. And we don't know why. But we do know later that Paul was royally upset. And Barnabas was a little more tolerant, and maybe we'll say something about that in a bit. But anyway, so the three musketeers become only the two, Paul and Barnabas. And they continue through that part of Asia Minor, it's called, that part of modern-day Turkey. And that's Paul's first missionary journey. It's probably where the Galatian churches are located. We go to, not yet the second missionary journey, there's another trip to Jerusalem. This is a very important one. This is the first council, Acts 15, where there was a big debate about snip, snip, something very important to Jews, and they were debating about Gentiles, right? The Jewish Christians, the Jewish Jesus followers were saying, you got to be circumcised, you got to be circumcised, you got to be circumcised. And the Gentile Jesus followers were saying, you got to be kidding, you got to be kidding, you got to be kidding. And so anyway, there was a big kind of division, and anyway, Paul and Barnabas and other church leaders met in met in Jerusalem, and there was a very important decision which had some. I will just maybe have a question about that. I'll have to save it for that. So this would be then Paul's third visit to Jerusalem as a Jesus follower, the third time he'd been in Jerusalem as a Jesus follower. Then we get the second missionary journey. Paul and Barnabas said, let's go back and revisit the churches that we started on our first missionary journey. But right away there was a disagreement because Barnabas says, let's take John Mark, and Paul says, no way, Jose. He bailed on us last time. And you may attribute this story to Paul's harsh character, although maybe it'd help you to know that Barnabas and John Mark were cousins, so there was a little bit of family connection involved in this. And Paul had, we can make some educated guesses, some pretty strong reasons about not taking John Mark. The good news is later on they were patched up. In Paul's later letters, we see references to John Mark. And so there is a reconciliation between the Apostle Paul and this younger missionary. Anyway, Paul and Barnabas say, well, let's go our separate ways. So Barnabas and now John Mark go back to Cyprus. You say, of course they went to Cyprus because that's where Barnabas is from. Thank you. Just to double check you're listening, right? And then Paul has to find somebody to go with. Who's going to go with me? Well, there's a guy earlier mentioned in Acts by the name of Silas, and he's a mature believer. And so Paul and Silas, and they begin what's called the second missionary journey, but pretty soon they pick up a young person too. You see the pattern? The first missionary journey, 2 senior and 1 junior. Second missionary journey, same thing, 2 senior and 1 junior. The junior being Timothy, right, who becomes Paul's spiritual son and close ministry supporter. Anyway, a bunch of things happen on the second missionary journey, which I don't have time to tell you about, except you're going to come back on week number 3, right, when we talk more about Paul the missionary. Anyway, then there was the third missionary journey. Oh, by the way, at the end, Paul goes back to Jerusalem again. That would be the 4th time he goes to Jerusalem as a Jesus follower. The third missionary journey, let me just say a couple of things. Paul ends up in the first part of this journey in Ephesus. I'm just stressing that because Paul was there for 2 years and 3 months, which is a long time. So a lot of important things happen while Paul is in Ephesus for 2 years and 3 months. So you may want to ask me about some of that, or I just want you to realize that you need to fill in. There's a lot of little details that we could fill in at this particular point. One thing I want to stress that's happening around this time is Paul is starting a collection. And Paul is hitting upon his Gentile churches, his predominantly Gentile churches, for a big financial gift that he's going to bring to Jerusalem to bring to the Jewish Christians. Okay? And you ought to realize that there's a lot more than just like diaconal ministry or money going on here, right? almost certainly, Paul is going to use this financial gift coming from predominantly the Gentile wing of the church. He's going to give it to the Jewish wing of the church, right? Because I think it's doing a couple of things. One, it's saying something about Paul's ministry. There are a lot of Jewish Christians who question Paul's legitimacy as an apostle. It's pretty hard to question whether Paul was a real apostle when he comes riding into town with a boatload of cash and some living, breathing converts, Jesus followers who are Gentiles. And I think that Paul saw this as a way of bridging this ongoing tension between the Gentile wing of the church and the Jewish wing of the church. Just one little evidence, in case you're a bit of a skeptic about this being a big deal, is when Paul was on the third missionary journey in Corinth, he wrote to the Romans from Corinth. And at the end of Romans, he says something like, I've been wanting to come to you for a long time, and I'm planning still to come to you for a long time, but first I got to bring this offering, this collection. And then he says something very striking. He says, pray that they, that is the Jewish Christians, will accept it. Just think about that, right? I mean, I don't know. I imagine that I was like super rich, and I've got lots of cash, and I'm coming here to Valley Presbyterian. I like you guys, right? And I know you have maybe some financial needs. And then I say to people back home now, pray for me because I'm going to Phoenix. Pray that Valley Presbyterian will accept this free gift of money that I want to give to them. I mean, why? You see what I'm saying? So the fact that Paul has to solicit prayers from the Roman Christians that the Jewish Christians would accept it already shows in Paul's mind there's a lot at stake. There's more at work than just a financial offering. Anyway, during this third missionary journey, Paul is picking up cash, and churches are sending representatives. So Paul has a growing entourage on the third missionary journey. He's picking up more cash and more people as he's slowly but surely ultimately going to end up back in Jerusalem to give this gift. Well, he finally comes at the end of the third missionary journey. He brings the gift, yay. He goes to the temple, and that's when that thing I told you about earlier happened, right? They think he brought in a Gentile believer when he shouldn't have. He's arrested. And then he's sent to Caesarea. The governor is living in a nice mansion built by Herod the Great already in the new city of Caesarea, named in honor, of course, of Caesar Augustus, right? What better thing to show you really love Caesar than just build a whole city? This is actually quite an amazing city and harbor. But then you have to go with me to Israel, right? And think about these things and see these things in person. Anyway, this is now many years after Herod, and the Roman governor lives there. And Paul isn't in prison, he's in house arrest. For how long? For 2 years. Under one governor, Felix, under another governor, Festus. He meets with different people. The Jewish leaders want to try him. That's when he meets with the Sanhedrin. He does the clever thing to get them divided. Anyway, at the end of that, Paul reaches into his pocket. No, not this one. That's the apostle card. In this pocket, he pulls out the Roman citizenship card, right? And he appeals to Caesar, right? And so this leads then to the journey to Rome, the boat crash, the miraculous things. He finally ends up in Rome, where he spends at least 2 years. And when we think of Paul in Rome, we don't think of him in jail cells. We think of him in maybe an apartment, right? House arrest. We talked about that earlier, right? So Paul is receiving guests. He's sending his workers to different congregations. He's writing letters. During this time, he wrote Colossians, Ephesians, probably Philippians, the little letter of Philemon. Anyway, the end of Acts is Paul is openly preaching the gospel in the capital city of the Roman Empire. It's not the end of the story of Paul, though. He may have engaged on a fourth missionary journey. I'm looking at my watch. I'm going to just skip over that. Maybe you'll ask me about that. I want to have some Q&A in just a minute. So there's some evidence for a fourth missionary journey. And then I think he is released after his first imprisonment. And again, woe to me unless I preach. So Paul preaches the gospel. He's rearrested This time, his Roman citizenship cannot spare his life, and so Paul is beheaded. Is that a good thing to be beheaded? It's a lot better than being crucified. So Peter was not a Roman citizen. He couldn't reach into his pocket and pull up a citizenship card, and so he was crucified, right? Tradition has he was crucified upside down. Paul was a Roman citizen, and so he wasn't crucified. He was led outside the city walls, because you don't have dead people inside the city, so why kill them and have to take them outside? He's led outside the city walls, and in somewhat humane, noble Roman fashion, he is beheaded. And so today, if you go with me on my Italy tour, one of the churches we visit is the church, not surprisingly named St. Paul Outside the Walls Church, because this is the tradition where Paul was killed and buried, right? One last word. Paul says this is when he was in Rome in the 2-year imprisonment, to the Colossians. He says, remember my chains. He basically says to the Corinthians, to the Christians in Colossae, look at me. I mean, I'm suffering for the gospel, right? And that should prove that the gospel is genuine. And don't be surprised if you have to suffer too. And so a parallel phrase, at least for those of us who are children of Paul, are you willing to think of yourself now as a child of Paul? All right. And are we willing to suffer on behalf of the gospel if that's required of us? Well, friends, that's the end of the formal presentation of Paul the man, and we have just a few moments to stretch out our time, and I'm hoping that you'll be brave enough to walk up to one of these 2 mics and to state your question so that those who are live streaming can hear it. And I'd be happy to hear your question, and I hope I can answer it. So who's going to be brave enough to start us off? Go for it. Brother Ed, I believe. Yes.
Tell us about mission number 4, the trip number 4.
The trip number 4. So the reason we postulate, remember I said difference between shouting and whispering? The reason we postulate the 4th missionary journey is there are some details in Paul's life that we can't fit anywhere in anything I've said so far. So for instance, you'll see on the slide, I think, Paul says to Titus, right? When I left you in Crete, da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da. And you say to yourself, when was Paul in Crete? I mean, I guess the boat landed there quickly when he was arrested, but that doesn't fit, okay? And so there are certain details like that we can't easily. You can try to fit them into earlier parts of Paul's life, but they don't easily fit there. And so that's at least the first reason for suggesting that after the first arrest, he would have been released. By the way, I could say it was very common for not the regular low-class person, but a Roman citizen, right? Lots of Roman citizens were banished as their crime, right? We have lots of stories about especially influential people who said, oops, I was so stupid, I was living the high life in Rome, and then I said something critical of the empire, and now I'm living down in the middle of nowhere. And so it's actually not at all. But again, Paul wouldn't just go somewhere quietly, right? Woe to me unless I preach. And there are other, if you look through the slides, which you have a handout, you'll see that some of the early Christian writings, not from the New Testament, right afterwards, make reference to the fact that Paul was released and so forth. So you put it all together, and actually you can get a pretty strong case for the existence of this 4th missionary journey. Even though those numbers are not so accurate, right? Because remember, the first one is not really the first, right? In terms of a journey, Paul was at least involved in missions for a long time before that. But question. Another one. Be brave. Go for it. Oh, I think I recognize Pastor Dave here is going to come up with a question.
Jeff, I've always, in your material, you've written about how both Paul and Peter were persecuted during the reign of Nero. I guess my question is, for a Roman citizen, was there a process where they would appear before some kind of tribunal? Was there a jury of the peers type of a thing? And what was the reasoning for Nero's execution of Paul?
Okay. For the question, I'm going to get to it, but I'm just going to say that the question raises a very important point, and that is the nature of persecution in the first century. And, you know, Sunday school pictures mislead us, and Nero's persecution misleads us, because Nero's persecution was a very limited persecution. It was only in one place, Rome, and only after this devastating fire. And Nero was building this golden house. And so the rumor was spread that actually Nero started the fire to get everybody out of there so he could have room for this house. And so one of the reasons that Nero blamed the Christians was just to somehow take blame off of himself. So that's very misleading, you know, the idea that Christians were burned alive or fed to the lions, okay? So Christianity was not an officially recognized religion, and it was not officially condemned. So the persecution in most of the New Testament we should think about is not jail cells, is not chains, is not lions, but is what? Is ostracization, ridicule, maybe spontaneous acts of violence. And you might not think that's very significant, but that's because in the States we're highly individualized, you know. But in many parts of the world today, and even back then, social networks are all you have. And so if you're ostracized, I mean, that's significant pain. If you're ostracized from family or from whatever networks you needed to survive. So I think I've answered your, oh no, not quite. So what would you appeal to? So we don't know exactly what happened, but it seems to vary a little bit from emperor to emperor. So some emperor like Claudius, who was alive during Paul's life, but Paul didn't appear before him, right, actually took these kind of things quite seriously, and so it seems like if you're a Roman citizen and appealed to Caesar, you probably met before Caesar, right? But others of them didn't take it so seriously, and so we can't know for certain whether Nero, for instance, delegated it to someone else, you know, or whether he took it himself. I mean, that's going to vary a little bit. Nero had an interesting reputation. Nero, you know, thought of himself as a great actor and thespian and musician. I mean, no. And you have to realize that actors in the Roman world were considered, like, terrible. I want you to catch this analogy. I hope it'll work for those of you who watch The Crown or The British Queen, right? So for a Roman aristocrat to be an actor would be like Queen Elizabeth to give a pole dance. Okay, you catching that? All right. Okay. And so Nero, you know, was going around thinking he was this great actor, right, and so forth. And in fact, his dying word supposedly was the world is losing. What an actor, you know, the world is losing, or something like that. So the important part from your answer is persecution was different than what we often think of it, right? Ostracization, ridicule, separation, and so forth, which was significant. And the persecution under Nero was limited to Rome and for a very short time, and we shouldn't think of that as being all over the place. And then finally, we don't know exactly what Nero did. You know, the buck stopped with him. He had the power, you know, to deal with it, but whether he dealt with it directly or designated it, it's hard for us to know. So my motto is, and I said it earlier, right? The longer I am, the better I'd be. Okay, so I think I could be good, but I don't want to tax your patience, and so I'm going to end our time with a closing prayer. I'm going to stick around if you have a question that you want to ask privately, and otherwise remember, email, and if nothing else, please come next week and invite others, right? We're going to do something different next week, and I would love for you to be there. But would you mind if I close our time with prayer? Let's pray. Our Father in heaven, we thank you for this opportunity to reflect together as your children and followers of Jesus about an important person whom you called, namely the Apostle Paul. We thank you for this opportunity to think more deeply about his life. And we pray that you will take these things and that they will help us to be better readers of his letters, better understanders of your word. I thank you for each person here and their interest in growing in the knowledge of your word, and I ask you'll bless that interest. Be also with us on our homeward way. Keep us safe from physical and spiritual harm. And may we, like Paul, be found today and in the days ahead to be faithful followers of Christ, in whose name we pray. Amen. Go in peace.